The opposite of fascism is not communism, it's democracy and the ability to disagree. To take away that is fascism by any name or color. Disagreeing with what one has to say but defending to death their right to say it is the foundation of democracy. The act of recognizing their right to disagree and being willing to defend that right is the process by which the social contract is granted legitimacy. Liberal values are more beautiful because they include the freedom to disregard those principles and embrace fascism if one so chooses. If conformity has to be achieved at the end of a gun, and the ideas one conforms to lack any meaningful legitimacy. If communism could be achieved democratically, it would be achieved democratically. That they can't win by ballot is why communists fancy themselves as revolutionaries. Bad ideas have consequences, and those consequences are measured in human lives. The reason I open declaring the value in disagreement is because we live in a world where people today would strip that freedom away from you if they had such an opportunity to do so. It is not just fascists who wish to do this. This sort of a world has existed before, and the Soviet Union was no stranger to using violence to force conformity. Polish prisoners of war, for example, fell into the custody of the Soviet NKVD, some 26,000 prisoners in fact, and why squander a good labor force? Several thousand were rumored to have been sent off to die in forced labor camps in order to mine for gold in Kolyma, a gulag in eastern Siberia. The remaining Polish prisoners of war were subjected to numerous interviews by NKVD officers under the pretenses of releasing them. The interviews actually functioned as a means of determining which Poles would be executed and which would be spared. The basis for this selection was political belief. The determining basis for life and death was whether or not any one prisoner could politically conform to the communist regime's desires. By April of 1940, a final decision was reached, and 21,857 Polish prisoners, military officers, police officers, and other Polish intelligentsia were executed by NKVD officers at Katyn Forest, Kharkiv, Kalinin Oblast, and other places of detention. After the fall of Nazi Germany, custody of many of the former concentration camps fell into the Soviets' hands, and rather than close the camps for the crime they were, the camps were utilized instead. The communist NKVD made it a mission to utilize the former concentration camp of Buchenwald for the internment of prisoners. The first prisoners were supposed to be exclusively Nazis, but later, anybody seen as a threat to the occupying Soviet regime could be imprisoned. The conditions inside the camp were crowded, cold, and plagued with pests. Prisoners who were interned at the camp were denied winter clothing, and the thousands of interned prisoners were denied adequate food. According to Soviet records, the former camp in Buchenwald became the death site for over 7,000 inmates interned there. Their remains were buried in the woods surrounding the camps, and the families of the dead received no notification as to the condition of their relatives. At the former Camp Sachsenhausen, the concentration camp there was used by the NKVD to intern German citizens just as it did with any other such camp. From 1945 to 1950, the NKVD-run camp became a graveyard to more than 12,000 prisoners. 50 different graves, 25 feet long and 13 feet wide, would house more than 12,500 bodies. The bodies exhumed had been starved, beaten, and subjected to the cold weather. Worse yet, the bodies were that of children and elderly, too young or too old to take part in any war, and guilty of simply being related to the wrong people or having the wrong ideas. When all was said and done, 45,000 died in Soviet custody in these camps, and another 40,000 were deported. The camps, which had operated under the pretenses of acting as holding places for the trials of accused criminals, would instead be used by the Soviet government to concentrate political enemies. A large number of those interned were never formally charged with any crimes, or given any due process before they were deprived of their rights, or even killed. The NKVD had acted as the Nazis did before them. Camps and gulags would be operated by the communist regime until de-Stalinization policies would close them. Millions would pass through these prisons, and of those millions, an estimated 2.5 million or more thought to have died in these camps by 1956, a byproduct of their starvation and persecution. In the end, none of it even mattered. Every experiment with communism failed, and the human toll of these experiments will scar for generations. When liberals get the bullet too becomes a catchphrase you use to express your disappointment in liberalism, You've progressed from being any kind of meaningful defender of democracy to a terrorist who simply wishes to kill people who disagree with you. But that wasn't real communism, some will predictably argue. There are better examples to look at than Stalin's Russia or Mao's China, it is argued, as if I'm simply supposed to ignore the fact that every time communism is attempted, it is done so by people who share or believe communist ideals and draw their ideals from the same source material as other communists. Spanish Catalonia summarily executed or assassinated at least 8,000 clergy and capitalists, and Rojava is a literal war zone. There are no good examples of communism. Whether by state regimes or small communes, they are often built on the bodies of others and justified on the idea that we simply cannot disagree. When re-education gulags are proposed for capitalists, fascists, and reactionaries, political prisons which deprive people of their freedoms until they come to agree with the communist societal structure, it becomes a fascism of a different color. Humanitarian gulags are about as oxymoronic as peaceful ethnic cleansing. There is no such thing as a humanitarian political prison, and to float the idea of such a thing reeks of fascism by a different name, and that is precisely the point I wish to make with this video. At the end of the day, red fascism is still fascism.